The Platypus Affiliate Society, for those of you who don't know who we are. We're established in December 2006. We organise reading groups, public fora, research and journalism focus on problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 1960s to 70s, post-political 1980s to 90s, and millennial 2000s to 2010s left, with the possibility of emancipatory politics today. We have some upcoming events. In 2 weeks, we'll have a teach-in on Bonapartism and proletarian socialism in New Zealand. Around Labour weekend, we'll have a walking tour where we'll look over some new left sites. We have weekly coffee breaks outside Kate Edgar around 2 p.m. every Thursday. And we have a weekly reading group in the Humanities Building on 6th on Tuesdays. If you want to see more details and updates, you can follow us on Instagram at Platypus UOA, or add your name to the mailing list that's on the merch table. And on the merch table, you'll find copies of the Platypus Review, which is a open review journal that you can submit articles to freely. Alright, tonight's panel is called "What is a Political Party for the Left?" In the wake of the Millennial Left's overseas failure in building social democracy via the Sanders, Podemos, Momentum and Syriza campaigns, the question of political parties seems to have returned to them on the left. Only this time taken up by the younger generation, inherited from and perhaps counter to their millennial counterparts' neo-socialist experiences. This return to party building has taken place against the backdrop of an ongoing crisis of both the Democratic and Republican parties that, since 2016, the left has been forced to witness from the sidelines. On the one hand, the Biden Presidency in the lead up to the 2024 election saw renewed international emphasis on steering clear of politics and taking up struggles to intervene in civil society, typically in the form of municipal organising and mutual aid. In contrast, there have recently been various trends globally to reconceptualise communist parties under the recognition that organising in the absence of a party would result in absorption into capitalist politics. These forms recall an older question facing the left internationally that goes all the way back to Marx's dispute with the anarchists in the First International. So, Platypus asks, 1. What is a political party for the left, and what are its goals? 2. Where do we stand with respect to the task of building this political party today? And 3. Can Marxism help clarify this task? If so, how? Okay, from going next to me, down there we have Tom Roud, who's a librarian and union delegate who is currently running as an alliance candidate for the Christchurch Council elections in the Central City Ward. He's also a founder of Canterbury Socialist Society, a branch of the National Federation of Socialist Societies. Next then we have Barry Lee, who is a member of the Palestine Solidarity Network Aotearoa. He was a member of the Progressive Youth Movement during the New Left era and did work in various functions in the leadership organisations of the Communist Party of New Zealand. Then we have Christopher Fackney, who is a supporter of the World Socialist Party in New Zealand, who wants to get rid of the profit system and establish real socialism. The World Socialist Party, NZ, claims lineage with the historical New Zealand Socialist Party established in the 1930s. And last we have Vera Ashborne, who is a supporter of the International Bolshevik tendency and a student at the Victoria University in Wellington. The meeting will go for roughly 2.5 hours. Every speaker will have 8 minutes to deliver their remarks, followed by 5 minutes each for responses, and then finally an audience Q&A. And afterwards, if you want to continue the conversation, you can come with us to the bar, K Road. All right. Do you, Dom?
Lovely. Kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou, ko Tom Roud aho. Lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me along, Michael. As Vera so rightly said, I am running for the Alliance Party in Christchurch, so I'm going to be speaking to a degree about the Alliance Party's point of view on those 3 questions, but I will include a disclaimer that as we're in the process of reformation of the Alliance Party, these are really only my views. Whatever constitutional efforts we are going to be making in terms of both the form of the party but also the programmatic commitments of the party will naturally be democratic. So these are my points of view that I'll be arguing for, but I have no more say than anyone else who happens to join. So just a bit of a disclaimer up front. I'll be mostly speaking from the perspective of the Alliance Party, though Socialist Society may come up, whether it's in the talk or in the conversation later. As far as what is a party of the left, I've sort of broken this down. What is the left? So, as many of you probably know, during the French Revolution, 1789 National Assembly, people sat down based on their affinity towards the president at the time and whether they supported the king, etc. So the left is literally, physically to the left, and the right to the right. That's where they sat down. From there, we get the idea of the party of movement, or the party of change, and the party of order. So, fairly straightforward in a lot of ways, but contains a lot within it. So, the party of movement against the status quo, the party of order maintaining it. The end. Just kidding. Okay, I'll keep going. So from the former, from the party of movement, basically, from this period, sprouts almost all elements of the modern or contemporary left, or really the modern left for all of modern capitalism, so 1789, so that entire period, you see the development of all aspects of the left over that time. Unionism, democracy, liberalism, republicanism, social democracy, socialism of every stripe, every flavoured bean that you'd like of socialism, communism, anarchism, all kind of come out of this point where that distinction is made about the left and the right. And then what is a party? Well, from my point of view, a party is nothing more nor less than a unified political bloc organised in some formal way. And the specifics of that depend a lot on context. So in the early anarchist movement, actually they would describe themselves as parties. If you meet anarchists today, they're very unlikely to do so, because what party means in common parlance has changed a lot. But what we mean by the idea of being unified, organised, etc., that's what it used to just mean, a party. There are people you can read who will talk about the time of whether you believe he was a real person or not, the time of Christ, and you think about what was going on in the Holy Land at the time, and there was a party of order and a party of change, and so on and so forth. There were these organised political units that were trying to compete for power in a very different way than we do now, right? We've assumed as moderns, as contemporary human beings, a lot of the norms of democracy, but nonetheless, this is not a brand new thing. Context is important. But anyway, so there you go. So a left party, a unified political bloc, organised in some sort of way, interested in movement, so changing the status quo in some sort of way. And then for me, a left party needs a few clear building blocks. One of those things is a baseline programmatic unity. So what I mean by that is the idea that you need a program of what you plan to do and what you're about, and it can be values, it can be more specific than values, but the point is it needs to be something that unifies the people who are going to join this party, and they say, I agree with that and I'll participate in that. And for me, I think it only needs to be good enough. It doesn't need to be perfect. It's about being good enough for a unity which you then move forward with this organised, with a party, with an organised form. So it's a provisional program in a lot of ways. I'm going to talk mostly about form when I talk about this stuff. I'm not going to go into specifics about what specific policies makes a party left. I'm not actually really that interested in that right now. So that's one part of it. Another part of it for a left party, unlimited membership, which is, from my point of view, anyone can join. That sounds very normal to us now, but it's 2025. When we're talking about the foundations of the left, when we're talking about the early days of forming these sorts of organisations, that wasn't the norm. Political organisation used to be for people with a certain kind of property, That's how they used to organise. You can read about the London Corresponding Society, for example. One of the things that they said in their early writings, our members shall be unlimited. And it was saying that anyone, regardless of their property category or whether they're a labourer, could be a member in good standing, just the same as everybody else. That's a basic foundation. Internal democracy, pretty basic in a lot of ways as well, which for me, I think one member, one vote is an obvious part of that. But I'm interested in the idea of a republican democracy, which is not it's the sort of disorganised, atomised democracy where, you all get a vote via a Zoom call and so on and so forth, or something like that. It's more like a recallable delegation of power. So from the base, you elect upwards different levels of things, different levels of representatives, which then have the one member, one vote as on your behalf, but they're also recallable, always recallable right through from the bottom to the top. So yeah, organised democracy, not an abstract and atomised democracy, which we often see today. I think a left party would be to have the right to form factions openly, and whether they're permanent or temporary doesn't really matter, whatever is needed at the time. I think we see a lot of left parties unwilling to do this, but I think it's a mistake. So you have those things, and then what exactly does the party do? That depends on context too. For me, in 2025, as you may have guessed, since I am actually running for council, I think in New Zealand, ignoring electoral politics is short-sighted, but it's also sort of a fake problem for a lot of socialists because, how many socialist organisations have the resources and level of organisation and number of members to actually answer that question seriously? Is it a hypothetical question that we pretend is principle, or is it a practical question on the basis that I know for a fact there is no explicitly socialist organisation in this country, for example, that has 500 members and can run for general election, right? So we talk about this question as a question of principle, but we're actually not being confronted by it. So I look forward to the day when it's a real question, when socialists have to say, oh shit, we've actually got enough members now. What should we do? Are we still anti-electoralist? It's very easy to be anti-electoralist when you've got a couple dozen members. So yeah, we'll cross that bridge when we can, hopefully sooner rather than later. And then moving to the next questions, this is very brief. Where are we? I think in some ways we're starting at the beginning again. But I do sometimes think I heard it as an Irish joke. You can insert whichever, preferably less problematic is good, nationality you like, about stopping by the side of the road and asking for directions. And you ask someone, I'm trying to get to here, and they say, well, I wouldn't start from here. And that's kind of how it feels with building a left party in New Zealand, or now, at all, anywhere, It's not the best place to start from, but it is where we are. So there you go. The emphasis as far as Marxism and the clarity it can bring, I don't have a huge amount to say about that. I'm really curious to see what other people will say about that, who I think will bring more of that to the conversation. One thing that does stick with me, though, is the idea that we make history but not in conditions of our own choosing. And for socialists today, there'd be very few people who would say, these are the conditions of our choosing, are they? They're not that favourable. But what does that mean in terms of what we should do? Tactically, strategically, how do we build, how do we move forward? That's it. That's all I've got.
Sure. Well, my definition of left is basically the parties left of Labour. I know there's always been an argument about this. There's a lot of left-wing people in the Labour Party, but the parliamentary party which represents it is definitely a capitalist party. And my interest in it is in a socialist party, a genuine socialist party. I prefer the term socialist rather than communist, simply because communist throws up all sorts of images which we need to put away. We look at it where we went wrong. I think we need to learn from the past efforts, particularly of organisations like the Communist Party of New Zealand, which did do some good things. But we need to look at the good and bad and see what we can learn from it. And then we need a clear focus on what the party stands for. What is socialism? It's the social ownership of the means of production and the inevitable ending of class differences. That's the way I see it. It's not nationalisation or state capitalism. It's not ruled by the Socialist Party, and when I say Socialist Party, in actual fact, there can be more than one Socialist Party in the building of socialism, but they don't rule. The working class has to rule. And it is not the dictatorship of the proletariat, which was the image that Stalin moulded into it, which gave the ability for the party. It wasn't a dictatorship of the proletariat, it was a dictatorship of the party. As Marx and Engels wrote, the state as a force for controlling people will wither away under socialism and be replaced by a mechanism to administer things. And I envisage that the administration of social affairs will become the province of structures like the Workers' Council or like the early Soviets, which were workers' councils. And I know the slogan of the Bolsheviks was all power to the Soviets, but actually it didn't happen, or it got diverted. And the party is there to propagate the ideas and to steer the working class. But as Marx and Engels said, parties represent classes, and as you develop a classless society, not only will the state wither away, but the need for a party will wither away. But I think we need to be clear when we talk about working class, because this has been distorted, particularly a hell of a lot of material from Eastern Europe and elsewhere talk about the workers and they have a picture of a man or a woman in blue overalls carrying a hammer. Working class, which Marx and Engels outlined, all of those who do not own the means of production and have to sell their labour power to live. So that includes a wide spectrum, including professional workers and even the managerial sector, but they describe that as a grey area because they are actually the servants of capitalism. But it's not a matter of industrial workers or workers who get dirty by that. It includes doctors, nurses, teachers. I know Anna can say about in the Communist Party, teachers were regarded as being middle class, and that's a load of nonsense. And actually we can see now that what Marx and Engels predicted, they're all being pushed down into the same level as other workers, in which we see them striking and demonstrating and those things which we wouldn't have thought about in the 60s and 70s. A socialist party needs to recognise that the working class are going to have to seize power. I remember finding something in Lenin which I haven't been able to find again, where he said it'd be very nice if the capitalist class handed over power to the working class without a struggle, but unfortunately such a kind-hearted bourgeoisie has not yet been invented. I don't think so the capitalist class are not going to give up their power and privilege without a struggle, and I think that would be part of a revolutionary change internationally. The Bolsheviks were premature in many ways, but they seized an opportunity and they did actually start out doing a lot of good in terms of social reform, and they actually brought about the end of World War I. They expected the German party to do likewise, and the German party hesitated and got massacred. I don't regard revolution as a necessity, as a target. It's a necessity, and it's a bit like going on strike. Workers don't want to do it, but they do it because it's a necessity. And I don't go for parties that label themselves as revolutionary whatever, because that actually puts revolution on a pedestal, which it's a necessary process. And it may be that in smaller countries the capitalist class roll over if there's a worldwide movement, but we have to recognise that we're not going to do it without resistance from the capitalist class. And Marx and Engels were very clear they weren't setting up a blueprint, because they recognised that in different countries the process would be differently. But what they did put forward were 3 stages of development. Firstly, the working class uses its own forces to stop the old ruling class from returning to power. And this is the period known as the dictatorship of the proletariat. But that they envisaged, and I think that is a very short period. It wasn't in the Soviet Union because they had 14 armies attacking them from all directions, which is one reason why I think they finished up being a dictatorship of the party. The first stage is based on the principle of from each according to their ability to each according to their work. Marx and Engels described that as an element of bourgeois right. It's not total equality, but they saw that as developing into complete social ownership and distribution according to everyone according to their work, according to their ability, to each according to their needs. And it sounds utopian. It certainly would have been utopian 100 years ago, but now human beings can produce everything we need for everybody. It's just a matter of capitalism stands in the way. And also, if you had modern production without the inbuilt obstacles like built-in obsolescence, planning for obsolescence. I heard a thing on the radio the other day, Radio New Zealand, about Rover, making the Land Rovers, taken over by Chevrolet, and they took great pride in the maintenance of their vehicles. In fact, if one broke down, they would send somebody to send the parts free. But when Chevrolet took over, a top-level guy from Chevrolet turned up and asked about their obsolescence plan. And they didn't have one. And he said, you've got to have an obsolescence plan. So you build in obsolescence to the, whereas a socialist society would build in permanence and also make things repairable, because so many appliances things now are made so you can't repair them. So this way, the possibility of all the needs of people being met is there. It's just capitalism stands in the way. As far as the Socialist Party, it's got to be truly democratic. It must be able to speak with one voice, but there must be room for expression of alternative voices. The traditional communist parties were organised according to democratic centralism, which is supposed to be the information flowing up to the leadership and coming down, but it never worked that way. And it becomes the dictatorship of the leadership, and in some cases in the history of the Communist Party, the leadership were quite divorced from the rank and file. And also, the party has to organise and its work in line with the conditions, not blindly follow a formula from overseas or historical, but to act according to the conditions they have. The Communist Party, which then became after we broke with Stalinism, became the Socialist Workers' Organisation and linked up with the tendency of the British Socialist Workers' Party, which we, for a long time, the party in New Zealand had considered this countries like the Soviet Union as state capitalist, and which they had. But the problem with that was they then dictated how the format of your paper, what it had in it. You couldn't be a party unless you had some magical number of people, and that you should concentrate on building in the universities, which was a disaster for the Communist Party in New Zealand, because we had built, in fact, through before the 90s, built quite an influence amongst the working class. So I think that's very important, and you don't constantly look for overseas examples, which again was a trap that went through that. So the party in New Zealand broke with the Soviet Union, and that split. And if you ever get a chance to read the pamphlet produced at the time, New Zealand CPNZ Firm Stand, it was over fundamental issues like work in the trade unions, attitude to the Labour Party and those things. It wasn't China or Russia right. But then it seemed to be necessary to keep an example. And so it became China, and then when China hived off on the three wheels there, it became Albania. And of those parties that I visited Albania, they told us what we wanted to hear. They praised what we were doing amongst the workers, but there were other parties in that tendency who did the total opposite. So what did they tell them? You know, we were being fed what they wanted to tell us. On the question of candidates in capitalist parliamentary elections, at one stage the Communist Party used to stand a few candidates each election and get a few votes, very few. Well, I think it's a question of tactics. There's occasions when it is a useful tactic, and particularly if a Communist Party member gets into Parliament, how they act. And I think a good example, although he wasn't at that stage there as a socialist, Keith Locke used, when he was a Green MP, used the opportunity of Parliament to raise all sorts of issues which he knew was going to go nowhere, but it threw it out into the public arena. And that was, I think, a bit like the Bolsheviks did way back, where they used it as a platform as much as they could to promote the struggle for socialism, not to try and get change.
Try and wrap it up soon. You're a bit over.
Yep. Can we, I think also we need to recognise upturns and downturns in the class struggle, and not constantly say the working class is moving to the left when it's being in retreat. But can Marxism help? I say yes, but the Marxist classics aren't a holy writ, not like going to a Bible and looking for guidance. You have to, and particularly the works of people like Lenin, relate to historical period 100 years ago, and so when we read those, we've got to look at our situation, not just follow quotes.
Yeah. Kia ora, good evening everybody, and thank you for the opportunity. We are not a left party. We are in opposition to the left and to the right, as they are meaningless terms, as both want to retain the present system of capitalism, as both agree to assume political control of capitalism and its economical and political demands. We also stand firmly against reformism and the illusion that capitalism can somehow be made decent or tolerable to live under. Needs are ignored if you haven't got money or you cannot afford to pay. You only need to look around you at the current social problems. Human suffering, wars, threat of wars, environmental and ecosystem destruction, and waste under capitalism. We also refuse to be taken in by Leninist claims of having introduced socialism to Russia or China, North Korea. The vast majority of people who do not own capital must live by selling their labour power for a wage or salary, the working class. Those same people, you and I, are excluded from the control over the resources and productive machinery of the earth. These are in the hands of the minority of the capitalist class. Capitalism is a class-divided system, where the aim of production is not to satisfy people's needs, but to make profits. No profit, no production. It is the reason why production is undertaken and also why production is not undertaken. It is the system working normally. With it come financial crisis, booms, recessions, just like we've got now, unemployment. That's the way the capitalist system works. Dealing with the effects and not the cause means capitalism cannot be reformed to work in the interests of the class of wage and salary earners. So who are we? We are solely concerned with building a movement of socialists for socialism. In 1904, the Socialist Party of Great Britain formed. Companion parties followed later. Australia, New Zealand, Canada, USA, Austria and India. The World Socialist Party of New Zealand was formed in 1930. We concentrate exclusively on encouraging the growth of socialist consciousness and the organisation for socialism. This is why as a party we've refused to be sidetracked into advocating or supported democratic or social reforms or movements to set up new states or to take sides in wars. We are seeking to get rid of the profit system and establish a system of society based upon the common ownership and democratic control of the means and instruments producing and distributing wealth by and in the interests of the whole community. So what is socialism? It does not yet exist. It's an idea. When it is established, it must be on a worldwide basis as an alternative to the outdated system of capitalism. In a socialist society, there will be common ownership and democratic control of the earth by all its inhabitants. No minority class will be in a position to dictate to the majority that the production must be geared for profit. Production will be solely for human use and not for sale. The only question society will need to ask about wealth production will be, what do people require and can those needs be met? These questions will be answered on the basis of the resources available to meet such needs. In such socialism, unlike now, modern technology and communications will be used to serve and promote human interests. The basic social principle will be that people give according to their abilities and take according to their self-defined needs. Work will be on the basis of voluntary cooperation. The cohesion of wage and salary employment and unemployment will be abolished. There will be no buying or selling or exchanging, and money will not be necessary. For the first time ever, the people of the world will have common possession of the planet Earth. Drawing up a detailed blueprint for socialism is premature, since the exact forms it takes will depend on the conditions and the preferences of those who set it up and live in socialism. But we do know, broadly, that those features are essential to a socialist society, since no feature of society is today left untouched by capitalism. We may expect socialism to be similarly integrated and consistent. Finally, the importance of Marxism. Marxism is a method of assessing what at any particular time is in the best interest of wage and salary earners, the working class, and what should be done to hasten the establishment of socialism. We owe this largely to Karl Marx in explaining the conditions under which commodity production and money exist, and understand also the characteristics of a new society in which they would no longer exist. I don't tend to use the word Marxist, but I like to use the word scientific socialism more, because that's the way we analyse this capitalist system. And the main point is that there's two classes: the capitalist class, the working class. And it's a class struggle. You either own or you don't own, or you have to sell your physical and mental abilities for a wage and salary in order to live. We know that the social problems facing us are caused by the social system of capitalism, where wealth is produced for sale on the market with a view to profit rather than human needs. And it is our class interest, being the majority, to take self-conscious working class action and abolish that system and establish the next stage of human society, socialism. So the key principles of Marxism is as follows: that change is constant. In present conditions, capitalism are not inevitable. Where did capitalism come from? Why do we have money? Why do we have profits? Why do we have commodities? What was before capitalism? Feudalism. What was before feudalism? Chattel slavery. Warriordom. Before that, hunters and gatherers for 100,000 years, no money. That capitalism is the cause of social problems. That wage and salary earners can and must liberate ourselves by taking conscious political action to end the profit system. Only you and I can do it. We only have two choices: capitalism, socialism. Fourth, that socialism is an objective worth working for because it will mean the rational utilisation of the Earth's resources for the use of the Earth's inhabitants. It's been highlighted already, the absolute amount of waste, the amount of money built on arms and bombs. That will all cease. No police, no state. We have the resources, technology and the skills and knowledge to satisfy the material needs of every man, woman and child on the planet. Full free access to goods and services can be introduced almost immediately after the socialist-minded wage and salary earners win political power. This is what scientific socialism implies. So what is will not always be, and today's proposals could be tomorrow's reality. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou, ko Vera tōku ingoa. I'm here today speaking as a supporter of the international Bolshevik tendency. Thank you for arranging this. So, to understand what Marxism can tell us about the task of building a left party, it's helpful to start with what it tells us about the left itself. For the left means many things to many people. To some leftists, the left is every movement, force, politician who appears to be fighting, at the moment, for some alleviation of injustice, advancement of rights, lessening of oppression, or easing of exploitation, no matter the class interests they represent. Here, the left is a broad tent, and the left party unifies everyone in that tent for some form of progressive politics. To others, the left is everyone who is already a convinced socialist. The work there is to convince the working class they need to become convinced socialists and build the left party. What I want to argue for, what Marxists argue for, is a left party between those poles. Marxism is the history and science of class struggle. It tells us human society, throughout history, has been split on class lines, with a ruling class controlling the state and social structures to dominate and exploit other classes. It tells us what class is, a material relation to property ownership and production, and that classes have distinct social interests arising from their material position. It tells us capitalist society is divided into two class poles, the bourgeoisie at one end, the proletariat at the other, and the relicts of other classes being squeezed out of existence in between. And it tells us the working class, on whose exploitation capitalism depends for its existence, has the means and objective need to overthrow the whole capitalist system if it can be organized for it. The left, for Marxists, is not a narrow band of the already convinced, nor a broad tent of all those struggling against oppression in this exact moment. The left is everyone on our side of the class divide, whether they realize it now or not. Primarily, centrally, that is the working class, every sector of it, in every country on earth. And the left party is the expression of the common need of workers to organize forces on our side of the class line, whose interests are in overthrowing capitalism, against those on the other side of the class line, whose interests are in its preservation. This is one key insight of Marxism on the party. It must be a vehicle for working class politics, organized along class lines. There's room for auxiliary support from the lower ranks of the petty bourgeoisie, which may find themselves on our side from time to time against their oppression and dissolution. But the left party, for Marxists, is a workers' party. Whatever other elements may be allowed to exist within it must be subordinated to proletarian organization and politics, or else it is merely a bourgeois party with a working class tail. There is ultimately nothing for the workers in a joint party and program with any part of bourgeoisie, no matter how progressive or left-wing they may seem. The left party we need is a party of the workers, independent of other classes. But that is not enough. Workers' objective interests are for revolution, but working class leadership is pulled by 1,000 threads and pressures towards compromise with the bourgeoisie. The natural leaders of the working class under capitalism are the labour aristocracy and the union bureaucracy, whose natural politics are dead-end reformism. Such non-revolutionary leadership finds its highest form in the Labour Party or its equivalents around the world. Labour is a workers' party, one based in the reformist union bureaucracy, and the history of class struggle shows that every would-be workers' party that does not openly set its sights on revolution against the capitalist state and class inevitably becomes what Labour is now. That is the fate of Syriza, it is the fate of Podemos, it will be the fate of every similar attempt in future. Our struggle is not and cannot be to reform or replace Labour, but to defeat Labourism. Accordingly, the Marxist Party is openly and unashamedly a party for workers' revolution. It must set itself intransigently against the capitalist order from the outset. It cannot just be a big tent of all the workers, regardless of their consciousness or their politics, but must be defined by a clearly revolutionary program, worked out collectively by a Marxist membership on a revolutionary basis, and must bind its workers in common discipline to uphold that program and the decisions of its majority. Its demands must intersect the struggles and needs of workers and minorities, calling for what is impossible under the capitalist system and orienting them toward overthrowing it.
Oh, damn it. Sorry. Sorry about that.
You're fine.
Go to the back of the room.
It must actively intervene in the everyday struggles of the workers and oppressed to break them from the reformism and bourgeois ideology that pervade the class as it exists, expose and defeat their existing organizations, parties, and leaderships, and prove the necessity of its program and revolution itself. It cannot sit on the sidelines and preach socialism to the workers. It must fight along with them to win them. Sometimes in that struggle, it will find itself alongside the same non-working class forces or reformists that it seeks to defeat in pursuit of limited common ends. A working class party can navigate such short-term alliances without losing its independence or revolutionary character, so long as we never allow them to become more than temporary, never give up our independence or the right to publish material explaining our perspective and criticizing our partner's weaknesses, and never, ever surrender the call for working class revolution. Even if it alienates our so-called allies, even if it breaks the bounds of bourgeois legality or respectability, even if it risks repression and violence, the Marxist Party must, at all times, tell workers the truth about what is necessary for victory. Such a party, in the context of modern Aotearoa New Zealand, or anywhere in the world really, may seem a distant hope. We do not pretend that building it will be easy, but it would be even worse to fool ourselves into thinking that some other kind of party would do. What Marxism can tell us is that the confused tangle of broadly progressive cross-class parties and lowest common denominator leftist blocs that proliferate here and around the world are not fit vehicles for workers' power, and that the unfolding logic of class struggle will provide opportunities to regroup our forces and build the party we need. The revolutionary left is small now. It always has been, until the right moment arrives. Thank you.
All right, now we'll move on to giving each 5 minutes to respond. We'll start with Tom, and then we'll move on to Vera afterwards.
Okay, cool. Yeah, not a huge amount to reflect on there. I think a few things that jumped out at me, I suppose. Yes, the term dictatorship of the proletariat does seem a bit antiquated and confusing, particularly as the time when it was talked about, it was a fairly different context, I think, and was not really meant in the terms of like, yeah, how it could be interpreted in terms of modern parlance is probably very different what they meant by it, and it's probably not worth holding on to. I don't really care if you call it socialist or communist personally. Workers' councils, yes. I think what I found interesting, Barry, was probably the way I read it was the idea of like what was a relatively minority party but would help give direction, ideological direction to a workers' movement. I guess I sort of probably track in the other direction where I think any sort of party needs to be pretty majoritarian mass and basically be setting up what you could call a semi-state or a commune state or something like that to replace the current way of organising things, which you might not want to call a state at all, of course, but I don't want to get into pedantry about whether it's a state or not. But, you know, a way of organising society can be embryonic within a party, but only if that party is quite large and quite broad. Otherwise, it really is just sort of keep up the good work to the workers. I agree with the idea that abundance exists already and is just being held back by the current management of ownership and so on and so forth, and the market system. And the turning to universities and that being a failing strategy is interesting, and it makes sense to me in a lot of ways. It's one thing that we've tried to do, at least with the Socialist Society, is not get trapped kind of on campus because it's short-term gain for very little long-term engagement has been the experience of almost all organisations that have done that, because once you finish your degree and aren't trying to be distracted from that project you should really be doing, suddenly socialism isn't as sexy as it was before, when it's actually taking your free time, shall we say. What else came up to me? I think the idea that, it's a good bit of rhetoric that capitalism is an intolerable system, and in some ways it is, but in other ways part of the problem is that obviously it isn't, Like, it is tolerable. We continue to tolerate it at a species level. 7 billion people continue to tolerate it. So the trouble is that it is tolerable. And that's actually part of the trouble. That's part of the difficulty. It's like you've got a system that you can sort of get along with. A lot of people can manage to get along with it, which makes the necessity of revolution less immediate and a bit more abstract, even if it is true. It's not like if we don't have revolution, then our lives are just completely hopeless and worthless, and I don't think that about my life, and I don't think anyone in this room probably thinks that. So intolerable is an interesting word. It's good rhetoric, but I don't know if it's technically the sort of thing I'd agree with, and I'd sort of just push back and say that the actual problem is that it is quite tolerable, and what do we have to do to make it so that the alternative is more palatable than staying with this very mediocre system. I don't think I have all that much left to say. I'm curious about the definition of the working class that's been used. So wage and salary earners was used, material relation to production, but not necessarily expanding on that. Was mentioned by Vera as well. I quite like the idea of like the reliance on the wage fund, because I think it's important to consider class beyond the people that are currently earning either a wage or a salary, but actually pensioners, people who are forced into forced idleness, children of the working class, etc. The class is an entire body of people. It's not just the people that are currently being exploited by the capitalist system. It's almost all of them that are reliant on what you could call the entire social wage, from my point of view anyway. That's it.
Barry, 5 minutes?
I think on the last point, I don't think anyone's arguing that people on, we're on the pension, aren't still workers. But I think, and we're not got in mind a minority party so much as a party as large as it can be, but based on the socialist principles that'll take it forward. And one way the party will grow is by becoming involved in the struggles of the people for reform. But when socialists go into a struggle for a reform, they not only go into it to help people improve their lot, which in today's conditions there's a hell of a lot of room for that, but also they raise socialist politics. And because when workers are in struggle, their minds are much more open to different political ideas, and also the struggle against war. which we happen to be involved in now with the Palestine issue, is a vital issue not just for the Palestinians but for our working class and for the working class of the world. And it gives an opportunity to discuss politics with other people who have got the equal humanitarian, but they might be coming from a different angle. So the trick or the difficulty for a socialist party, and it was one that the Communist Party didn't handle, is the danger of being submerged in it and losing your socialist roots. And partly as a reaction to, with the split with the Soviet Union and the formation of the Socialist Unity Party, which basically became a party which gave you an avenue for a trade union position, and it gave up any real, it sided with Labour Party and even in the Rogernomics period until it became intolerable. So that is a danger, but it shouldn't become, as it tended to in the Communist Party, where it was elevated so that people have become really involved in a social struggle which may be something they're a part of, are then being criticised for being submerged in it. You've got to find a way to both be champions of the people for their immediate needs, because every time workers, or in the broader context, make a fight a battle and win a concession, it gives them confidence in their power. And that's something that capitalism does to workers, is it deliberately aims to make people feel powerless and that they can't change anything.
If one single man, woman or child is dying of starvation, lack of water, lack of health, lack of food, then capitalism is intolerable. We run, the wage and salaries, run the system from top to bottom. 90% of us run it top to bottom. We are the majority. The minority own the resources. We need to take that away. That's the contradiction of this society. We have no say in it. You and thousands and millions of people around the world keep voting reformist parties into government, into the state. The state represents the capitalist system. We need to take it away. We want a stateless world. There wouldn't be that war going on in Gaza. Why is that war going on? About resources, minerals, oil, fighting wage and salaries fighting each other, okay? Because politicians make them do it. And there's this contradiction that we need to look at. We're the only party that is saying to abolish capitalism. You tell me another party out there that's telling abolishing capitalism for a world without money. And that's our main distinction between what we are and other parties. We don't want any more of this capitalist system. We want a new system of society where human needs are at the forefront of everything that we do. Do you enjoy going to work? It's like a slog at times. Barry's retired. I couldn't wait to retire. I'm so happy. Seriously. Get by. But for the rest of us, we have to carry on working for wage and salaries. And with it, problems, social problems. They seem to ever increasingly get worse and worse. The misery seems to grow and grow. And we can change that. We really can. It doesn't help when those capitalist parties decide that, oh yes, we'll just have MMP and we'll get rid of all those small parties and you've got to have 500 members. That was the end of the World Socialist Party of NZ being never represented on the electorate vote. We can put up a candidate for a single member as an independent, if you like. We have no leaders in our party. We do not want to be led. That's why we say democratic control. You and I will decide what's going to happen, how the resources are to be used. Big difference, massive difference, but a big struggle. How do we get socialists then to elect a member, to get into Parliament, and eventually get enough members in so we can dismantle the state? There'll be no use for this World Socialist Party of New Zealand and its companion parties. They will disappear. Thank you.
Gosh, there were quite a few points that I wrote down. I should probably be a bit selective about them. Various definitions of the left were advanced by various of the panelists. I kind of want to pick into them a little bit. I'm not sure that a definition of changing the status quo in its way, or even a reference to that as the original framework, is sufficient. I think any reformist, and indeed any reactionary, could probably argue for changing the status quo. The question is not merely what we're against, but what we're for. I'm also not sure about the definition of the left as parties left of Labour. It kind of begs a question of what it means to be left of Labour, and whether such parties exist at the moment. Are the Greens or Te Pāti Māori left of Labour? Are they the left? Some people would say they are, I think. I disagree that the dictatorship of the proletariat is an antiquated term. I think it very aptly describes a particular stage of the world revolution, the need to hold power in some places by the working class, in the interests of the working class, before we can get to the stateless society. We need a state for class war, for revolutionary war. That's what Leninism is fundamentally calling for on the question of the state. And dictatorship of the proletariat, as opposed to socialism, I think captures that difference well enough. I agree with, I think it was Tom who talked about the definition of the working class as being broader than just wage and salary earners. Class as a block is bound by various social ties within it. There isn't necessarily a universal experience of being a worker that is common to everybody in the working class. Classes as social formations can be bound together by a more sort of general social condition than something that's necessarily shared by everyone. So working class kids, the unemployed, pensioners, remain workers even if they're not, strictly speaking, earning a wage. Obviously, the World Socialist Party is not the only group calling for socialism, and in fact, I'm not even sure it really qualifies as a party yet. I don't think any of us do. I think that's part of why we're here. To be a party in a meaningful sense is not just a group that publishes propaganda. It's an organization that can credibly claim some base in the masses, to represent some sector of society. I don't think any of us do that yet. And in fact, I think pretty much everyone here has endorsed the end of capitalism in some sense or another. I also agree about the need to take sides and stances on issues like Palestine. Here in New Zealand, that is a question of our own ties to the imperialist world order. Real things can be done here to stop the war, to stop the genocide, and those things would not incidentally, be striking blows at our own ruling class if they were to succeed. And they would raise the consciousness of the workers, raise their internationalism. From them, we can build higher forms of struggle, which I might pick that for my second last point. You cannot, will not, ever win the trust and consciousness of the working class and oppressed if you consciously abstain from their struggles, economic, sectional, democratic, what have you, and preach socialism at them from the sidelines. That's not just a moral question. It's not just a question of it's, right to stand up for the oppressed. It's also how we approach the masses with our program. It's how we connect it to their needs and build their consciousness towards higher forms of struggle. There's no real way to make that link if we just tell them that socialism is what they need. And last thing, I think the dichotomy of the majority-minority party is a bit of an illusion, a chimera. I think we all want the party to be big, but any really socialist party, any revolutionary party, will be a minority until a revolutionary situation arises, until the fabric of capitalism is, if not actively collapsing, then at least seriously frayed. The masses won't really be convinced that the system is failing them if it's not yet failing them. When it starts falling apart is when we will have our opportunities to become a majority, which I suppose is also the point about capitalism being intolerable. Tolerable does not equal good. I don't think any of us here like capitalism, or we probably wouldn't be at a socialist panel talk, but we're still here, we're still tolerating it. I would like to think that all of us are working against it in whatever way seems, best appropriate to us. I obviously have my opinions on what that way is, and so does everyone here, but we all live in it. We can't escape it. I think it's obvious the majority of people currently tolerate capitalism, whether voluntarily or not. And the only way out of that really is through it, to build the revolutionary party, to convince people through struggle of the need to overthrow capitalism, of the fact that they can't tolerate capitalism any longer. That's it, I think. Thank you.
All right, we'll open up to Q&A now. Try and keep it to just one question. I know people like to ask multiple questions at once. Yeah, Michael.
All right. I'll take it. I'll break the ice. And I'm kind of thinking on my feet here, so please bear with me, everyone. I was interested by what seems to be the spectre of Lenin haunting the conversation, insofar as I'm grateful to Christopher for explicitly raising Lenin, even if it is to reject Leninism, the Bolshevik legacy. When we think about Lenin today, what we are inevitably doing is conjuring his image after a period of time in recent decades when we did see this vision of big tent socialism, left unity coming out of the 2000s that was effectively liquidated in the Millennial Left era with the Sanders, Corbyn, Podemos, Syriza sort of social democrat movements that Vera alluded to. So with people returning to the question of the party, the capital P party of Marxism, would be to invoke the memory of historical Marxism, which was the synthesis of the workers and the intellectuals. It is to invoke the memory of the vanguard. But are we still suffering from this kind of post-Cold War allergy to the vanguard, the anti-elitist kind of conception that people have of Leninism? Do we agree that that is correct or incorrect? What do we think about the memory of Lenin, and can we think about Lenin today in the year 2025?
Do you want to take it?
Well, we want to forget him as fast as we can. He's done so much distortion of the case for socialism. In 1917, Russia was basically peasants, early stages of capitalism. And when they got in, they decided that we'll do the thinking for you. Socialism is going to come for 500 years or whatever, he said. And as a result of that, parties like the Communist Party, different socialist parties all popped up and misconstrued the whole meaning of socialism, which has been one of the stumbling blocks for us as a party. Because that's not what socialism is. It's a world without money. Abolish the states. So in that sense, it has been an obstacle for the case for socialism. And what actually eventuated in Russia, and Barry spoke about it earlier too, was state capitalism. You know, just a whole lot of people with high-paid salaries, all the wealth and all that was coming in, the wage and salary earners there were being exploited. But instead of capitalism like how we have free, it was state capitalism. And it's no better, but that's what I would say. Yeah, it has been an obstacle.
Does anyone else want to take a question?
No, I don't think it's necessarily an obstacle, but I think that there's a lot of lessons in it. And I mean, so I said the Soviet Union, well, Russia was, it wasn't a developed capitalist country, but it's very much like the Paris Commune. You know what Marx said about the Paris Commune, they stormed the heavens. It sounds, if you look from the distance, like a hopeless cause, but the conditions were there, and they did it. And what Marx did was, and Lenin and Engels, was to then take the lessons of that. As I said with the Bolshevik Revolution, when it occurred, and the revolution itself was relatively bloodless, because the army actually, the military actually supported the revolution largely. I know that the Romanovs got murdered and that kind of thing, which wasn't something the Bolsheviks wanted. It was the counter-revolution which embroiled them in countless civil war, and also an embargo. So, and that's what people don't realise, there was a tremendous embargo, so they couldn't buy parts for trucks or railway line or parts for trains, and they're trying to fight a war with a lack of transport, and that caused all sorts of problems, and it actually resulted in the party taking a more commandist position. But when the Bolsheviks immediately after the revolution, they introduced tremendous social reforms which people don't know about. They legalised homosexuality, abortion was free on demand, and complete equality for women, and things like that, fundamentals, which all disappeared under Stalin, because what Stalin did was put Lenin on a pedestal. He wrote a book, The Foundations of Leninism, which basically is putting down Trotsky and elevating himself as a person that stood alongside Lenin, whereas he wasn't. And so that, plus the fact that the Civil War had meant that the party played a much more directive role than it should have, allowed the revolution to be turned into a state capitalist regime. But I don't think that, I think Lenin played a part and contributed some valuable lessons. It's a question of how we learn from them and how we go from here.
I guess I'd probably add, talk about Lenin and Leninism probably needs to be distinct to some degree, because as Barry sort of says, when we talk about Leninism, most of the time what you're meaning is like this ratified and codified is the word I was looking for, state ideology post-Lenin's death, or very much close to it, to justify whatever they needed to do next, really, with state power to do what they were trying to do, which was nation building in a lot of ways. I guess I sort of see Lenin as a very effective organiser in many, many ways. Not nearly as rigid as many people would think. If anything, he changed his mind considerably faster than most of his colleagues in the Bolshevik part of that party. But and that a lot of them couldn't keep up in some ways. But at the same time, I think obsession with him and whether he's a obstacle or something we need to really justify ourselves around would be like talking about Napoleon in the same terms. The vast majority of people outside of this room don't give a fuck, to put it simply.
I think the question of Lenin's legacy and of Stalinism is extremely relevant to the modern left. I think it should be relatively obvious what my position on Lenin is as someone who is here representing an organization called the International Bolshevik Tendency. But what we would take to be Leninism is not the state ideology of the Soviet Union post-Lenin's death. It is the theoretical current, the ideas on state and revolution and imperialism and organization and many, many other things promulgated by the man himself, which have been buried under a great deal of calumnies both from his capitalist opponents and his Stalinist successors. That Stalinism, at least in the USSR and the Eastern Bloc, is gone. That the capitalist order that spread those calumnies in the first place obviously remains, but nevertheless, I think there is opportunity to reappraise and correct a great deal of the errors and misconceptions that people have about Lenin and what he stood for and what his party stood for. The fact that those errors and misconceptions are still relevant today is perhaps typified in, say, the idea that Leninists proclaimed the USSR to be a socialist society. The USSR, in the minds of Leninists, was a transitional economy, a dictatorship of the proletariat, a workers' state, eventually a workers' state that was hollowed out by Stalinism and became what we would call a deformed workers' state. It was only the Stalinists themselves that ever claimed it to be socialist as such. Obviously, wage labor was not eradicated. Obviously, some class differences remained. It was nevertheless an enormous progressive step forward in terms of the rights, the common ownership, the prosperity of Russia and its minorities. It was the first state since the Paris Commune in which the working class took power, and the only one in which they ever really kept it for any length of time. I'm risking trailing off into nothing here, but I think disavowing Leninism, the Bolsheviks, projects like that, is essentially tantamount to disavowing revolutionary struggle. We don't necessarily agree with every single decision that the Bolshevik Party ever took in its history, pre-Stalin, but the alternatives suggested are voting our way into socialism or magically abolishing the state. But neither of those is a realistic possibility. What Leninism offers us is a clear insight into the nature of the state and what our relationship should be to it, what revolution means, and the need for it on a global scale. That, it turned out to be flawed in its application, is not necessarily the point. It was always going to be. It was done in very bad conditions. It still nevertheless offers us lessons relevant for today. That's it.
Sorry? Yeah, so I'm like talking to this sort of to Lenin a little bit. So obviously Lenin was, the party he was building, the Bolsheviks, were a covert party because of the level of repression experienced in Tsarist Russia. And so they, generally speaking, they had to be professionals, right? Like that's the point of what is to be done, is we need professional revolutionaries who, under the extreme oppressive conditions, are able to organise and to build and cater and things like that. Lenin also writes about, I can't quite remember when, or where, rather, but he writes about the conservatising effect of these cadre, even of these members of the party. I think that conservatising effect is especially apparent when what you were saying, Barry, during the Russian Revolution, or actually, maybe it was what you were saying, when during the Russian Revolution, it was actually, it was Lenin who was calling for all power to the Soviets. But before Lenin made that call, it was Stalin and Zinoviev, etc., who were trying to compromise with the provisional government. They were trying to compromise, and then Lenin comes along and says, "No, don't do that. Don't compromise. We need all power to these workers' organisations." So, sort of my question is like, considering this conservatising effect of the party, considering the specific conditions under which the Bolshevik Party were built, how open ought a party be? How and for what reason should someone, a communist who is interested, at what point do they become a party member? Do they become someone who is, engaged, has the right to vote within the party? So how, think about how open to the public versus how closed off, how secret, maybe more as Lenin conceived it as being secretive.
I'll jump in first if it's right. I think there's basically no need for secrecy in the contemporary left in New Zealand right now. That could change, but we are not under the thumb of a Tsar and in the sort of reaction to various assassinations of Russian businessmen and so on. I think maximum transparency, so long as it's not so embarrassing as to be damaging or so boring as to be damaging, I suppose. Aspects of building a party are not very interesting, but at the same time, the only way that people will learn what it takes to organise is actually seeing the debates and seeing the conversation that's going on and knowing who's involved, actually. And I think there's no need, unless you're planning to set up, and you shouldn't do this, a small insurrectionary group in New Zealand in 2025, there is simply no need to move into a sort of secretive mindset as far as your party organisation goes. It would be very, very strange. It would be alienating. It would add a barrier for people who are just vaguely interested in this stuff. And, there is not a line out the door, shall we say, as it is. So let's not make it harder than it needs to be.
I think the Socialist Party needs to take advantage of situations of legality, but keep in mind that it's not going to last. In fact, if you look at, not aimed so much at socialist parties, but if you look at the anti-protest act bills and preparation for bills before Parliament at the moment, New Zealand has taken the same path as has happened in England, and other countries have a massive swing to the right as far as countering demonstrations, controlling demonstrations, and incarcerating people who stand up against, in this case, the immediate struggle around Palestine, but also against the so-called threat of, well, there is a threat of war, but which New Zealand is getting drawn rapidly into it. This American, USA, I should say, not America, argument that China is a threat to us. China is a rising imperialist power, but it's not threatening us at the moment. It's threatening the USA because its economic power is overtaking the USA. But I think that the party needs to be, and the Communist Party tended to become, I suppose, intimidated by the fact that it was spied on by the SIS. They did find bugs in houses and meeting rooms and offices. they did interfere with the mail. They interfered with the mail of the Progressive Youth Movement. They also, what I found in research I did, they also let you know they're spying on you, because then you restrict your own activities. And that tended to happen in the Communist Party, that people become super cautious and then it actually restricts your ability. But I think the party in these conditions should be as open as possible. Obviously people have got to be committed to socialist change. But we have to bear in mind that it won't last and it can end very quickly.
I find capitalism, right? Socialism. Lenin in Russia was never going to have socialism, a world without money, where everything's produced for human use, right? It can't happen in one little national part of the world framework. It has to be worldwide. Capitalism is worldwide. So socialism, and how many times do you ever hear a party saying a world without money, abolish wages, abolish salaries, produce things for human use, production for human use, not for profit? You ever see a party do that? Every reformist party wants to keep capitalism going. They don't want to get it out. They spend millions and millions of dollars and pounds or whatever to vote for them. And now we have less people perhaps voting in some parts of the world, which indicates maybe there is some growing dissatisfaction. But what Lenin and that did then was the word socialism, communism, which by the way mean the same thing. You've had the Socialist Democratic parties in Germany, you've had the Communist Party of China, and so on, right? Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, but later on changed to socialism because of different issues with other parties. Our party, formed in 1904, used the word socialism, okay? But socialism and communism mean the same thing. We need a party or a movement that wants to get into Parliament and dismantle the state. That's what it's about. Because once you dismantle the state, there's no capitalism anymore. We have to get self-conscious socialists. Self-conscious. You have to actually believe and want socialism to work. That's the only way it's going to be happening. It cannot be forced onto you. It's not going to work. There'll be no democratic control. Why do you want to be led by Luxon, Peters, Picton? They can promise you whatever they like and they can take all those promises away. But their main goal is to try and run the capitalist system as smoothly as possible. Okay? As smoothly as possible. And coming back to Lenin, well, he knew he couldn't do that. And distorted it all. So those states like China, Russia, totalitarians, repressive, millions died. The rest of the world's saying, oh, we don't want socialism, we don't want communism. So you can see the challenge for us. Now, things might have changed a little bit, but the fundamental thing that hasn't changed, capitalism is still here. And next year, you're going to go to the voting booths and you're going to be voting capitalism. Unless we can get some socialists from our World Socialist Party New Zealand standing. Imagine if we could actually have 500 members. Because we don't accept members of our party unless they actually understand socialism.
I'm sorry, mate. In 95 years, how many members have you got?
I couldn't say. In New Zealand, maybe 35, 40 might have been the maximum at any time. But that's not the issue.
It seems like you've set yourself up with an extremely high bar to even get to the point of talking to people about socialism, to me. Like, I know the SPGB, I'm actually quite sympathetic to a lot of what they say.
SPGB,
yeah. But I just, it's really hard to sort of like hear, you know, we just need to get, you know, a majority in Parliament, and we've had 35 members ever. in almost a century. And then you complain that Lenin said it was going to take 500 years to get to socialism. How long it will take with this paint? You know,
That's just a comment
like let's be really honest about what we're talking about here. Like, I have sympathy for what people term impossibilism with socialism. I think it's a really interesting provocation, but it's really impractical, and it's kind of hard to sit here and just sort of go, we'll just run 500 members from a party that's not got 100 members ever. In almost a century, in a country of 5 million people.
Well, put it another way. All I've had from the moment I grew up was capitalist propaganda. I don't actually have access. I don't own the propaganda machine, newspapers, TV, to get my ideas across. You have to have money to put those things across. I just stand in the elections for the party in 1999 with a capital outlay of $2,500. I'm going to make a big indent trying to get leaflets and brochures out across the whole Wairarapa electorate. Yeah, we got, I think, 29 votes. Managed to be able the opportunity to speak at different venues alongside the Alliance Party and different other political parties there. Managed to get some articles in the local community paper to get our ideas across. I dare say this though, we never had one article in the daily Wairarapa Times printed though. It is a struggle, hence the opportunity to come here tonight. But the only way it's going to happen is you understand how capitalism works and the need for it to change so that not one single man, woman or child needs to suffer unnecessarily. Instead of slaving away for wage and salaries where there's exploitation taking place, surplus value, this is how profits are created, and this insane machinery for growth at the expense of the planet and human needs. And the capitalist system won't be finished with the Earth. They'll be looking at the Moon, Mars, and it keeps going. We do what we can. But we will not waste our time voting for capitalism or reformist parties, because nothing's changing.
Certainly there is no party presently worth a vote in New Zealand, at least. I also think it would be illusory to suggest that we could simply vote the capitalist system away. They tried that in Finland in 1918 is what I meant to say. Where the Mensheviks won a majority, I believe, and started trying to dismantle the state, and the state fought back and killed them. Which is exactly what would happen if you try to dissolve the capitalist state by fiat from Parliament. As for the question that was originally asked, I think the question of the openness of the party contains two aspects within itself, and one is secrecy, for which I agree with Barry. The conditions of our organising are legal now. That doesn't necessarily mean they will be in the future. We shouldn't organise as if they will just be legal forever. As soon as and to the extent that we become a threat to the capitalist system, which, let's face it, we currently are not, we will find ourselves being repressed. That is the purpose of the state. It is to protect the interests of the ruling class. But there's another question here, which I think is also a very important one, and it's consciousness and commitment. The distinguishing factor of the Bolsheviks versus the Mensheviks, as I understand it, was originally about commitment. It was about the level of participation in the party and its organizations necessary to be a member of the party. It was about the extent to which more casual members should be considered the same as fuller members. And the position that we have is that the party, as and when it exists, the Leninist organisation, the pre-party, is an expression of the highest consciousness of the working class as it is. That's not necessarily to say we're right about everything, but it is, like I was saying in my first talk, necessarily a revolutionary group. It necessarily has a program that is based in Marxism. That's not to say that we shouldn't let new people in. Obviously, that is the lifeblood of the party. But if those people are to meaningfully contribute to the program, the practice of the party, and it is to remain a Marxist party, it is to remain a revolutionary party, they need to be inculcated to at least some extent into what Marxism means, what revolution is, what the theory underlying the party they are joining is. So it shouldn't be an automatic process of just signing a form. There are so many different dangers to that. Not everyone is going to understand what phrases like working class and socialism and oppression mean when they are necessarily taking an interest. Our job is to teach them. And if, without teaching them, they get a stake in what the party stands for, it is very rapidly going to become a reformist party.
Any other questions? Near the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, Francis Fukuyama famously said that this moment represented the end of history. It was like that liberal capitalism was the end of human development. I was really amused to see very recently that Francis Fukuyama now says that the free marketeers went too far and we now need social democracy. So I think what that actually suggests and plays into is I think that there's an openness to socialist ideas right now that I don't think has existed probably at any other point in my life that I can think of. I was born in 1976. But also there's an openness to these ideas, but on the same level I think there's also a real lack of theoretical understanding, particularly among the left. We've sort of lost a lot of that theoretical understanding that would allow us to talk to workers about these things. So that's sort of the conundrum I sort of wanted to pose to the panel of what you do in that situation, because it seemed like perhaps workers in 1925 would have had more of an idea of what we're talking about tonight, perhaps than workers in 2025 who now.
Do you want to say
I think there's what's happening now, and I don't say it's socialist consciousness, but a tremendous dissatisfaction because our living standards are under attack on all levels. And this happened since the Employment Contracts Act. The benefit cuts was a deliberate move to cut wages and conditions, and that's been an onslaught since then. And consecutive Labor governments haven't fundamentally changed anything. But so there's a tremendous amount of dissatisfaction there. There's a big change in the public mood, like even towards the issue of Palestine. We were part of trying to start up a pro-Palestine group in 1973 and it went nowhere. And now the public support is tremendous. But also, but people feel powerless, and that's what I said before. And we are going to be under attack, and it's not just abstract. It's, for instance, in Britain, somebody who speaks publicly and says they support their resistance in Palestine can be accused of being an agent of a foreign power, and exactly the same legislation is before Parliament right now in New Zealand. I think the potential is there, and I think probably, I don't know how wide the sympathy for socialism is, but I would say probably the potential there is much more than it was, say, in the 60s and 70s and when I became involved.
I think, there's, like you say, there's a growing disenchantment, but they don't know how to change things. You've just got the reformist parties, and a lot of people are not voting either. Maybe they're dissatisfied with the so-called status quo, but they know that there's something fundamentally wrong, either by their own consciousness in their day-to-day activities, what they experience. They're unemployed, can't have enough money to pay the power bill, or they're out on the street here or whatever. So, from that social consciousness, then that will hopefully get them thinking that there's got to be a better world, better place. But it's capitalism isn't just going to fall over on its own. And the interesting thing is that it's a minority that are in control. And in fact, previous epochs of history, feudalism, chattel slavery, there were people in control, a ruling class. Now, the next stage has to be the majority, wage and salary earners, to make that next change. So we're not working for wages and salary. And we don't have all this human suffering and misery that we have today around the world.
Any other question? Thank you.
This is interesting. I'll ask the question here. Your question relating to socialism. I listened to the four speakers on the front. I get the impression that they can't agree upon the definition of socialism. So what are you accepting as an answer to your socialist question?
Just I'm treating it very, very broadly because I think that a lot of people who, normal workers would have trouble understanding a lot of the conversation going on here.
So I'm having trouble because there's four different versions of socialism, but up here, so which one are you taking out?
That's a good question.
Yeah, who are you asking, Joe?
Yeah, because a lot of people will think that Russia and China was socialism or communism, and they've said that it's so
Yes,
distorted.
I don't think any of us do, which I think is germane to the point.
Maybe what it is instead of say what it is instead of what it is not, because we've got a lot of what it is not.
I would define socialism in a very loose sense as a stateless, classless, moneyless society in which exploitation and oppression are fundamentally impossible. I actually suspect that's probably relatively close to how my fellow panelists would describe it by and large. And I'm not sure what we are disagreeing with, although feel free to correct me, any of you. I'm not sure what we're disagreeing on is the definition of socialism so much as the methodology of getting there.
That's the challenge, is the methodology. But it's very clear what socialism is. It's a democratic control and common ownership of the world's resources that produced for human use. Producing and distributing for human use. Stateless, no wages, no buying or selling, no exchange.
Yeah, I think where there might be a difference is potentially what we think we should be doing in the meantime. And it's not just a question of tactics as such, it's more a question of is there anything worth doing less than talking about that specific issue? That's a pretty big distinction, because I think there are things worth doing that are less than that. I think it is entirely reasonable for left-wing, socialist-minded people to listen to Bernard Hickey talking about how fucking stupid it is our economy runs on real estate. That's an entirely reasonable use of your time. It's a reasonable use of your vote to try and change that, especially if you're a renter. These are not things that I think we just put off forever because they're not technically socialism, because no, they're not. But that's what Joe was talking about, the socialist ideas, or the vaguely left ideas, social democratic ideas, are in the ether of it, and they're being talked about by people that aren't particularly left-wing. And I think that's interesting, and it really could potentially mean we're going to see some differences in the next few decades in terms of how capitalism decides to manage itself. I think it would be worse if we leave it up to those people to decide what the limits of that is. How far is too far, and they'll only do this much to manage it. And I think when we push at the edges, we can do interesting things with it. I think Sweden found that when they tried to implement the Maidner Plan in full and were told very firmly by their capitalist class, no, we're not going to do that. But it was interesting that they tried, or your example even in Finland, it's a slightly different situation, but it's the same sort of things, like how far can you push these ideas at the edges, and just leaving it to, again, I quite like Bernard Hickey, but he's not particularly left-wing. He's just noticed an absurdity in the New Zealand economy and is quite articulate at saying why. So if we leave that conversation only up to the Labour Party and the Greens and the Bernard Hickeys and the Francis Fukuyamas, apparently, good God, definitely not him. It'll be like Roger Douglas coming out and saying, what if we, renationalise powers? What if you fuck off? If we leave it up to them, that's not going to make the discourse better. It's going to make it worse. So we sort of have to deal with the fact that we do live in the conditions that we do, and we live in the context of whatever's being talked about and whatever is immediately available for us to talk about, and that doesn't mean we don't critique it. It means that we use the critique to push it as far as we can, because one, it'll actually make people's lives better, and my general view is that we don't want to immiserate the working class until they're so fucking in such a bad state that they can't do anything but revolt. I actually think the process is the opposite. It's uplifting people to the point where they think, I can do all of this, I have access to all these resources, I should be part of the conversation, I should be part of a democratic society that organises all of this, because why not? I'm already the person who's making, doing everything, that makes everything work. Workers build the world renewed every single day and should be part of running it, and should just run it, really. But you don't get there by them having their lives get worse and worse. You actually get there by making their lives better in the meantime, and I think there's a way to do that that doesn't just buy people off and make them comfortable. Or more tolerant, if we go back to that word that we had a bit of a conversation about earlier. There's a way to do that in a way that raises people's horizons and makes them think, if we can do this, imagine what we could do if ... That's the important stuff.
All right, if you could try and direct your question to a single panelist. Yeah, go.
I'll do it to Tom.
Okay.
So I think the notion of, has been discussed, of the party organising, having some principles to organise around, the concept of like a working class party as a memory of the working class. I think the questions of education, about trying to explain views, consciousness, abolish capitalism as a goal, recognising raising consciousness in it requires struggling against to achieve something, just to uplift their ability. So, that question of the memory of the working class, parties being organisations of struggle, principle, that sort of stuff, praxis, all of that. How does that exactly mesh, recognising all of the energies that come from the system it's trying to survive in, create itself in, a party in and of itself? Security kind of comes into that, right? How would you see that working, pushing for it? What would you envision as the best way to do it? Since we've talked about some critiques of each other's perspective, what would you envision that?
To try and contain all of those aspects of what builds a party.
How would you make that work and get it going?
That's a really great question, and that's a great. I've been running a campaign, so I always say that's a great question when I need more time to think. Well, I'm quite heavily influenced by thinkers like E.B. Thompson, and I think when we think about organisations of classes and what a party might be, like I gave a pretty narrow but also very vague definition of a party. I think when we think about like a class organisation party, like that slightly more specific thing, it's not just the rigidity of like, this is our program, this is what we believe, and we're going to talk about that now, and and we have our meeting, we've got the minutes, and so on and so forth. It's a much more civil thing. and with a small c, not like in terms of being polite, but in terms of being enmeshed in people's lives and representative of a way of being, basically, which is shared to some degree by all the participants within it. So, you know, the idea that class expresses itself almost in a self-defined way, because it says we are that, you know. Class is not actually... it's not best to be understood as a purely objective economic unit. While it is that in some ways, it's not interesting when it's that. It's interesting, it's meaningful politically when it's much more than that. So I think I like to think that the party to develop needs to think of itself as much more than just an electoral vehicle, for example. I've obviously been doing that side of things a little bit recently, but also much more than just like making sure everyone agrees about the theory, particularly about the interpretation of when exactly the Soviet Union became a deformed... Sorry, I'm just making... But you know what I mean. Like, that is not the entirety of the conversation, making sure that everyone knows exactly what socialism means, or exactly when the USSR became worse, or changed character, Stalinism happened, whatever. Like, it's more than that. It has to be a part of the social fabric of the working class and the people that's meant to represent. And actually, they're, you know, even though they are obviously compromised and a problem now, the reformist parties would do that as well. That used to be what a party was, and really what's really interesting now, if you have that memory, the historic memory, not just of the class but actually of politics generally, it's that the social democratic parties in the middle of the last century and earlier, and so on and so forth, were these social institutions for the people that were members of them. You know, the Labour Party gala in a little meat worker town could be the social event of the year, you know. That's different than just talking about, well, Lenin was good up to this point, and then in 1918 he did the blah, blah, blah. It's a very different thing. It's a very different thing. And how exactly you do that hard, you know, really hard. But I think that's how parties become something that's much more interesting and much less just this mouthpiece for a particular point of view about what, like, if it's boring, it's just the policies, or if it's more interesting but quite rigid, it's just the specifics about the historic record of the class struggle or something. It needs to be bigger than that.
My thoughts are, you know, looking at that sign that says the left is dead, think, well, what was it that attracted people in my era to join the Communist Party in New Zealand? Because, if, you know, we set things in the time, that was when I was a young teenager, McCarthyism was still quite strong in New Zealand. You know, you get called out. A boy in front of me in my physics class had a sign up so the teacher couldn't see, saying, "Como go home," instead of "Pom go home." But what was it that attracted people to an organisation like the Communist Party? The Communist Party, as I remember it, was involved in a lot of industrial action. The members were part of the union in a very strong way and had a lot of influence, talking to a lot of workers because they were on the job. Yes, our workforce has changed very much. We have all these self-employed people, like casualised labour with no conditions, and on call, which is absolutely abominable, not tolerable. You tried. But what was it that attracted people to it? It was, one, that theory and practice went together. It wasn't just theory. It was that it was exciting, it was interesting. You felt like you were going out and talking with people. You could see if there was an action, that would be celebrated, that action, and you would meet other people and it became infectious. These are the kind of things. And so what I'm a bit worried about is, you know, that link between how class struggle actually comes into taking a path to socialism. You know, the Bolsheviks, their conditions were completely wrong. You know, it was naughty. They did that at the wrong time in history, but they did it. So, you know, what was it that attracted people in there? Those simple slogans that were so important of peace, land and bread. What is it that will help attract people in Aotearoa today when we've been much more individualised? It's all where everything's turned into a commodity, where knowledge is a commodity, where knowledge is very expensive. So how is that going to work that can be generated? So I'm wondering among the panellists, I'm not hearing how is it that people of all ages, and when I was a young person, because I came into politics very young, I became a conscious activist at the age of 14 and started organising and those kind of things. And it wasn't seen as being strange because people went to work at 15. If you're, and so your responsibility to life was much greater, but you had the opportunity to go to work too, unlike today. But what I'm wondering is how do we make that today, in this era, from interesting people, being in contact with people, being part of people's lives, being part of the culture, and then to be able to raise the issues of socialism, because it's not just an academic exercise. So that's what I'd like to hear from the panellists.
I think an important part of it is being integrated into the struggles of working people, because there's a tremendous amount of when we were young and involved in things, who would have thought of doctors going on strike, nurses going on strike, marching up Queen Street, teachers going on strike? That was unthought of. Whereas now those people have been consciously steered into a much more out of necessity, because people don't go on strike because they don't like going on strike. They go on strike because they have to. They know they're going to lose money, but they've got to fight back. I think socialists being involved in that, it's like the struggle around Palestine. You've got a tremendous participation by migrant groups, which is actually quite rare in New Zealand, because migrant minorities feel they are discriminated against, and they always have been. And but now they are actually coming out into action, and when they come into action, they feel the strength of solidarity amongst other people who feel the same way. And you can see it in our marches and rallies, the lift in people's spirit when they find themselves amongst hundreds or maybe thousands of people who feel the same way. And what we've got to do is try and steer some of that energy towards the idea of changing the whole structure of society. And I don't agree for 1 minute that you can do it by electoral means, because Parliament doesn't hold the power. It's actually the big money and the bureaucrats who hold the power, and the parliamentary debate is a circus, really. And if you got to that point of appearing to be a threat, they would soon make it illegal. I mean, it's not that leftists haven't been persecuted in New Zealand. People lost their jobs because they were seen as being communists. My childhood ambition was to be a policeman, and I entered Trentham for 19 months training with left-wing ideas, and I lasted, I graduated, I became a constable on the beat in Auckland. I lasted less than 3 months, and I wasn't even given a reason why I was sacked. But the SIS were involved. So that's democracy. That's the real nature of capitalism. You don't have a democracy. You're allowed to think you do, and that's what I keep talking about, this legislation before it, this new Terrorism Act, the amendment to the Crimes Act called Countering Foreign Interference. The so-called Independent Police Conduct Authority has actually drawn up a 159-page document. God knows why they think it's their prerogative, which is calling for protest-specific legislation. And it's full of recognising your right to protest, but it's telling you how what you've got to do and how you've got to do it. And of course this legislation about protesting outside in the vicinity of a residence, which is now being rushed through as a result of someone breaking a window at Winston Peters' house. You know, all of this stuff is geared at curbing civil liberties. And we have to realise that democracy under capitalism is a very thin, very small d.
Going back to your question, because that's one that's always on my mind too. And I guess the word that comes to me has always been how much enthusiasm I've got to do things. You know, like get involved in the party, look at standing, going to meetings, getting on the radio, trying to write articles and that. And I've had some periods of 2 or 3 years doing it, and you have a family, you know, other things come up. And I guess when this opportunity came up, I've come here. Otherwise, I was talking to my plumber the other day, he's doing a job, we got onto Karl Marx, a whole lot of other stuff, and that surprised me. It's just word of mouth. You're walking down the road, you talk to somebody, something comes up, you try and turn it around. There's a contradiction here, cause and effect, you know, try and plant a seed. As I said earlier, I don't own the propaganda machine of capitalism. I don't own the newspapers, the TV. You try getting your ideas into there. It's not easy. Because we want new members, we want young people, obviously, we do.
I kind of agree with Chris. I think you just got to be in the world and find those opportunities to talk to people about that sort of stuff. I think what's quite tricky about now, perhaps, is that people can scratch that itch quite differently, and it's a yeah, sure, sorry. I think people can scratch the itch of feeling like they're in community with others in terms of having a common way of thinking about things much more easily than they used to, basically due to technology. So I think the left can get very stuck being like, well, what we've got to do is organise a protest, and then we're going to have our physical magazine or our leaflet that we're going to give people and stuff. And the vast majority of people are just going to watch that on a screen from their home. There's not an easy solution to that, because I don't think it's enough to just watch it, to consume it, you know, to not be part of it and just consume it. But it's kind of where we've ended up. It's much easier to consume your politics than it is to have to build them, I guess. But I think the least we can do is be open about what we think and be there to talk to people about it. And it seems kind of simple, but just go about our lives, but also remain genuine to our politics and talk about them with people. Because one thing that really needs to happen, and I definitely felt this very much when I was still thinking more about socialist society rather than the Alliance, because we've got a bit more recognition to some degree, people remember what it was, but socialism and stuff and Marxism, it's a thing that you hear about as a meme online, or you see it referenced in a TV show or something, but you don't know anyone who believes that stuff. But you probably do. They just don't talk to you about it because they wait till they come here to talk about it, to a meeting, you know? So that's the bit, that's the problem. You've got to be out there and just sort of be like, this is also what I think. And I also love cricket, and I'm going to go and drink 3 pints this evening and watch some cricket. Or I am in a brass band, or I do this. You know, you've got all this other stuff, and just another fact about you is you're a communist, you know? And people go, oh, guy's also a communist, you know. We used to have lots of famous communists in this country, you know, artists and so on, that people would be household names. But I think a lot of us, we save the leftism for when we hang out with the left. There's not much use there. We all agree.
I disagree with large parts of that, I think. Not that one shouldn't be a communist in one's daily life, but every new member of the AGT in my period of recruitment has been won through struggle, through meetings with the left, through arguments, through connecting the things that we say abstractly about program and intersecting the needs of the masses with like what is actually going on the ground. And that is the point of the protests and the publishing arm. It's to get those ideas out there on a scale larger than individual, to force them into people's frame, to have those conversations, create frameworks for them. More than just one-on-one, but as something that will raise the consciousness of many, which ultimately is what we need to replicate this model to any scale. Like, I think this ties into some of the things I was saying in my talk about the need to kind of be in struggle with the workers and oppressed. You can have these kinds of fireside conversations with your plumber or like the neighbor or something about Marx or, you know, the ways in which our economy is at this point based on land banking and speculation, but that doesn't really mean anything to them in their daily lives because it's not connected directly to something that they need and are fighting for. But there are plenty of people out there who are already fighting for things, who already have needs that are not being met, who we can meet and engage with our ideas and build their consciousness. That requires getting involved in that fight, I think. But that's probably the best engine for building consciousness that we have. Ultimately, like, the left is very small. There are lots of people who are kind of sympathetic to various things we might call socialism, but we are a tiny, tiny minority right now. It's most efficient, I think, the best strategy to engage with people who are already in some aspect of struggle, who already know that their needs are not being met under capitalism, and to try and, or who know that sort of instinctively in like the daily aspects of their lives, but maybe haven't connected that to a big theoretical structure, don't have like ideas beyond capitalism as exploitative and bad, and meet them there and fight with them, and while we're doing that, build on them. Struggle against the false consciousness that they might have from the liberals who are leading their struggles, or the reformists who are telling them that they can't go on strike because it's illegal. I don't know, it just seems like the most sustainable way to build revolutionaries long term.
Through the discussion today, there's been something that's kind of arching over it that I think was alluded to directly by Barry in terms of the failure of the German Social Democratic Party, which is to say, like, Rosa Luxemburg, right? They often evoked opposing Lenin, and often sort of when looked back on, kind of seen as kind of posing the question of the seeming opposition of reform and revolution. I just was curious what the panelists made of this history and this seeming opposition, and if I had to, do I have to pick people, or no? We got time, cool. Yeah, in that case, I'm just interested to see what they would make of the seeming opposition, both the reform and revolution, and also between Lenin and Luxemburg.
Everyone's go first. I'll answer very briefly because off the top of my head I don't have heaps to say about it. I think the SPD, up until it was a catastrophic failure, was an extraordinary success. You know, it's one of the, it's like the largest, from what I recall, and most significant, and like I was saying, enmeshed in people's lives, Marxist party that the world has seen. It was enormous, and they had a pretty clear, I mean, the Erfurt program, maybe not perfect for today, but it's pretty good. You know, if someone wrote the Erfurt program for New Zealand, I'd read it, you know. So they were starting from a really great point, and they totally fucked it up. They shat the bed when it came to World War I, and then, you know, helped betray the Spartacist uprising, which, from what I recall, Luxemburg was not really that keen on, but being a good you know, democratic centralist, so she wasn't going to she lost the vote, so she's like, well, we better do it then. That's sort of how I think about it, I suppose. And I think that pointing to that particular era, reform and revolution within the SPD, there was an ongoing conversation then, and now when we look back at it, we can easily go, because of the sort of the reformism of the SPD. It was like, well, it's a very broad party. I mean, in the 1880s and stuff, they were basically just like German nationalists in it. You know, it's like it's a very diverse party at certain points that changed over time. That's the only thing I sort of think as far as reform or revolution goes. I mean, you hope for the latter and do whatever.
I guess not to sort of, sorry, just to push on Tom a little. I guess like the thing that made me think of it and really kind of push me would be that you sort of evoked the idea of a cricket team. But this would be a time in history when there's like 1 in 3 German workers who were a member of a Marxist organisation. They had sports teams.
Yes, bicycle clubs,
etc. They played football, not cricket because they're Germans. But, you know, I guess when the question is kind of, sort of either end of the table, but on your end, when it would seem to represent the fulfilment of that vision of a broad-based, sort of socially integrated kind of workers' party, and they did you say shat the bed?
Technical term.
What's to
stop that happening again?
Sure.
I think.
Why not?
I think that, you know, none of us are going to sit here and be like great men of history theory of things, but I think it was just entirely a failure of leadership. They voted against everything they believed in and everything they said they believed in the entire time. It wasn't like there was a theoretical rot that was going to show that they were definitely going to vote for that, because up until the time the vote came for war bonds, they wouldn't have, but then they did, you know? What can you say about that, you know, other than a catastrophic failure of leadership? Not unlike deciding to go to Afghanistan to do a bit of self-criticism of the alliance. That's long before I was politically active, but, you know, total catastrophic failure of leadership to vote for that sort of stuff. As far as the enmeshed in the people's lives and stuff, I mean, it's actually really tricky these days, because I think the period of the German Social Democratic Party then, it was when working class people weren't being given any sort of ability to do that outside of that, whereas actually there's not really a dire need for socialists to set up football clubs for workers, because they can actually join them. They are around, you know, that the civil society is atrophying, but it's bigger than it was in that interwar period and the pre-war period where the state was not interested at all. Whereas now we do lovely things like we get all that money that some workers spend on pokies and we redirect it to the local football club, and so other workers can have a nice football team, and we should feel really good about it, apparently. Yeah.
Not to sort of actually, you in particular, twice in a row.
That's fine.
A few points in that regard. I don't think it's true to say that the SPD was a huge success until it was a colossal failure. I think it was a huge success and a colossal failure at the same time, and the reasons for that are probably worth digging into. It was an incredibly large mass party. It commanded the loyalty of an enormous amount of German workers of all sorts of different social strata. Like, the sports clubs and stuff are really interesting, but the important point about it, I think, is that it was an organization that brought together just a plurality, I suppose, the largest possible, or I think you called it the largest party in terms of its base in the history of working class parties. It brought together an enormous amount of workers of all different kinds and social interests and beliefs, and that is its success in a way, because that is what the party was trying to do, and that is also its failure. That is its failure because the conditions of the working class were not the same as when Marx was sort of promulgating his own ideas about the party. By that point, imperialism had bedded layers of labor aristocracy into the working class. There were segments of the working class who were being bought off by the capitalist class through imperialist super profits. into beliefs that they could come to an accommodation with their national bourgeoisie, beliefs that the system could be made to work for them, that they had a long-term interest in securing the benefit of German economy, German imperialism, maybe adjusting it in a more equitable way, but nevertheless, that their interests were no longer in overthrowing the state and collectivizing everything, that some kind of accommodation could be reached with capital. And that is what tore the party apart. It is not simply a failure of leadership, though it certainly was a failure of leadership. It was also a failure of organizational form and of organizational principle. That's the whole basis for the Vanguard Party, why we talk about having a sort of committed organization of people who understand the program of Marxist cadres. Because the alternative is a sort of mass program in which any interest within the working, sort of mass party in which any interest within the working class, no matter how contradictory it is to the goal of revolution, can be represented within the Workers' Party. That's the organizational model Marx and Engels worked on, but it's the organizational model that failed, not just in Germany, but more or less everywhere at the start of World War I. As for the dichotomy between reform and revolution, I think there is a dichotomy between reformism and revolution, but it's not the case that Marxists shouldn't fight for reforms as they are germane or try to push them in larger directions. And I also don't think it's the case that we shouldn't stand for office if the need arises. But in doing those things, we need to bear in mind that the possibility of reform, of changes that materially benefit the working class or oppressed minorities, is always finite. It's constrained by the economic limits of the capitalist system, and those limits shift and change. As they grow, the spare room for reform grows. The capitalists can surrender more of their wealth to different segments of the class or different oppressed groups to bring them to some kind of roughly stable accommodation. But those things can only be temporary. As the economy contracts, as the spare fat that can be used to buy off different groups within capitalism sort of diminishes, those reforms will, by a fairly natural economic pressure that manifests as economic pressures do in social and political forces, start to come under threat. I think it's no coincidence, for instance, that the massive wave of repression of the rolling back of queer rights, of women's rights around the world is coming on the heels of an incredibly sluggish global economy, like crises pending and not even all that recently past, lack of growth anywhere. The system needs to find places to cut. I'm not trying to suggest it's all blind forces either. There's obviously human elements involved, but those human elements are reacting to real pressures. The struggle for reform, as distinct here from the struggle for reformism, is by no means an unworthy one, but it's not a solution. No reform we win is ever fully safe. No extra prosperity we can eke out through class struggle for the working class under capitalism is ever secure. Ultimately, that's why we're revolutionaries. We can't secure the needs and rights of the workers and of the oppressed under capitalism. The system itself will claw them back. We need to overthrow the system itself if we want those things to be secured. Sorry, that was a bit of a ramble.
Well, I'd just like to add that I don't think that if the working class doesn't struggle for reforms, it's going to be pushed down and pushed down and pushed down. I mean, the capitalists will do anything to increase their profits. almost to the fact of, eating their own tails, as it were, because profit and return on investment is the thing that they want. And there's any amount of capitalists that would have children climbing up chimneys and down on the mines if they could do it. Look at the way the Nazi Germany, they used slave labour when they had to, or when they needed to, or when they wanted to. So we've got to keep fighting for reforms, but it doesn't mean to say that it's going to make fundamental change in society. And actually, living and working conditions have deteriorated in my lifetime. The so-called, and it wasn't, there were rich and poor when I was a kid, and there was a lot of poverty, particularly amongst rural Maori. But working people in the cities, in trade unions, could exist and could get by. And that has been taken away from them. And so we have to fight for these reforms. There's no choice in it.
Well, I'd be saying the opposite. I mean, in my day-to-day life, there might have been sometimes I've had to go on strike and do different things to hold my standard of living, for whatever reasons. But all that energy that we put into trying to reform capitalism, it's not solved those problems. Reformism isn't solving those problems. The problems still exist. So we have to find a way, we have to get rid of capitalism. It's either socialism or communism. There's nothing in between. Production for use or production for profit. How we get there is the struggle that we've got. Again, that self-consciousness that we know what we're voting for, what we're supporting for.
Why did you go on strike?
Oh, well, that's going back to 1976.
Oh, no, I mean in like a principle.
Oh, principle. Well, I was part of a union. They wanted a pay rise. Yeah.
So you participated in the
Yes, I did participate in it.
For your
well, well, actually, at the end of the day...
Did you not participate in it for mine?
For mine? Well, I see it in two things. One is I was trying to keep my living standards to a certain height, but at the same time I knew that the union was the best chance to do it, but the union are not advocating for socialism. They're still supporting the capitalist system, you see.
The union bureaucrats always do, but my point is, it sounds to me like the basis on which you engaged in that kind of struggle was fundamentally because it was in your personal material interests to do so, and your argument has been that the Socialist Party should stay out of the struggles of different parts of the working class.
Not on an individual membership. No, they won't, because everybody's circumstances are different. I mean, you go to a union meeting, something will be put forward to the members of the union, and they will vote on it, whether to go on strike or not to go on strike. So, if that's the situation, you will, because that's what the membership's agreed on. And you've had a chance to participate in that discussion at that union meeting.
I mean, I'm not sure the union meetings I've been to are as democratic as all that, but I think this is still a little bit beside the point I'm trying to make.
Well, the strike's a weapon that the working class can use, or wage and salary earners can use, to try and better their working conditions.
But is there a political end to it?
No, capitalism carries on.
I mean a political purpose.
The political purpose of going on strike?
Yes.
It's just trying to maintain a certain living standard, or the standard of living is not regressed or going backwards, or they feel like we're being threatened, or something taken away from us.
Let me put this question to you another way. If there wasn't the fact that a union had voted on it, do you think workers should join actions of other workers? Do you think they should join the struggles of different oppressed groups? Like, if someone were trying to arrest me for using a woman's bathroom in 3 years' time, do you think the Workers' Party should have a stance on that?
I think the party members shouldn't be just passive participants. In my experience in the Communist Party, active union members were more than just participants in it, but actively in organising the workers on their job and that kind of thing. With some successes, but the party never really handled it very well, I don't think, because there was always this struggle between, as I said earlier, about whether you got submerged in it or not seeing the fact that the socialists need to be acting as showing leadership in these things, not to become union officials, but to, and often sometimes good and sometimes bad, they were in battle with the union officials because of the union officials' natural tendency is to compromise with the employing class. But they're not passive participants.
Yeah, we have one more question.
Cool. I think just to touch on that one, because I think that's a good thing to raise, especially I guess throughout history of minority participation. I'll come back to the notion of the party, right? Party leadership, progressive forces, how to make sure they're tied up in class struggle and political struggle anyhow. How does the form of the party, just on that earlier you mentioned, how does the form of the party influence that content and vice versa? Because they're obviously in relationship to each other and do influence each other, and the relationship outside also forces that. But how do we make sure that those progressive struggles across all, Indigenous struggles here in Aotearoa, Māori struggles, gender struggles, sexual liberation, women's rights, all of those things are all tied up together in material class concerns across a lot of these things, whether as actual wage workers or in participating in reproduction of society, looking at the non-paid labour that people do, right? How do we make sure a party keeps that in mind? I guess to everyone,
it's more, I guess, in the form of the party, I think it's an interesting question, which is what you said. I'll have to ponder on that a bit more. I think in the content, a program that doesn't address those things is not a complete program. Because when I say it, what I said at the very start was like a program that's good enough, but that doesn't mean it's such a short program that it doesn't really say anything and anyone can just be like, yeah, cool. It has to be able to touch on these issues that remain, some of the various contradictions that people are facing at the moment, and those may change over time, or the emphasis might move at different times. Some things will ebb because it'll be, he'll win some reforms and so on, and then they might be called back and suddenly that thing will take greater prominence. But that would be one of the key ways is to make sure that your core program, and I don't mean at the level of like a big list of policies of what you'll do when you win power, because you're probably not going to win power anytime soon, but like it's kind of a minimum maximum program thing that I work with, but I'm doing it in the context of a kind of, I'm afraid, semi-reformist way of thinking, but it is kind of that formulation of like that stuff should be part of the minimum. The minimum doesn't mean that you don't talk about things beyond the economy, direct wage worker struggles, etc., etc. You've got to keep it all in mind, and the benefit of that is that it should pay dividends, because that quote that everyone likes, that we don't live single issue lives. Even if you can imagine a nuclear family wage worker with just the man going to work and the woman staying home with the kids, well, she's still there, right? She's got the kids, and there is a concern there as the family unit. That's why I talk about the class as not just whoever's going to work. I mean, these days everyone's going to work and the kid's probably being handed a tiny mine to be sent down into the crypto mines or something, but yeah.
We're already over time, so brief responses.
Yeah, I don't think the workers have got, the party's got any choice if it's integrated with the working class. It hasn't got any choice but to become involved in these activities. And but party members have a perspective of a long-term objective, and being involved with other people in struggle, it gives the opportunities to discuss the long-term objectives.
Yeah, we just really want to get people along to discuss, socialism, become socialists. But at the end of the day, we just can't reform capitalism into the interests of, wage and salary earners. We're the majority. We're the next stage of history where we take ownership of the means of production, so that we can produce those things and distribute them freely, free access to everything. We have no leaders in our party. We discuss everything and vote on it, and that's how society should be. We shouldn't be having our faith in leaders. You just see what's happening.
I think I would reaffirm that it's vitally important for the Workers' Party, if it is to be one in any serious sense, to be involved in all of the struggles you mentioned and more. Every sector of the class that's oppressed, every minority that's oppressed. It's later, my brain's a little slow. Be the tribunes of the people, as I think was Marx's phrase. And by the Bolsheviks had, say, their women's organization, they had a youth section, like many contemporary parties or pre-party groups will have similar things. There'll be other organizations set up in different social struggles that have their purpose of connecting to that social struggle. The term we often use is transitional organization, a place that can kind of bring revolutionaries and non-revolutionaries together to fight for those common causes within the framework of a larger struggle. I don't know if I defined that very well. Again, slightly tired. And through being involved in those struggles, the party members, the organisations that can feed the experience of those groups back into the centre in the way that nerves feed information into a brain to build a picture of what's going on in the world. And the brain can send out its signals to react to that information. There is a continual process, if this is being done healthily, of information transfer between every struggle of every sector of the class, and the party as centre of those whole struggles that can synthesize all of their experiences and build them into something more unified. I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but...
It's a good spot to end it there. Some members will go into a bar later if you want to take one.
Yeah, we're walking up to Cave Road, so feel free to take along.
Which one are you going?
Probably we're going to try something in the arcade.
Sorry, 2 seconds again.
Yeah, we're going to try something around there. Yeah.
Thank you. Good.
Round of applause.